All right. Welcome to another edition of the forecast competition discussion. We're going to try something a little bit new here to start with. I think I've sent this out to most of the folks who are on the forecast contest discussion email thread, but we're going to work on one of our goals is to improve or work on communications. And so an idea that the forecast contest team kind of came up with is to sort of mimic a briefing between vendor and client. And this is sort of our script. You can see it on the screen here that we're going to follow. This is our first time kind of going through it. We're going to go through it with a couple of the forecast contestants that are on the screen right now. Again, the way it works is we're going to mimic sort of a vendor-client meeting. Our goals are to be clear and concise, address all of your clients' questions and concerns, and hopefully include actual outcomes. The assumption is, you're on a client call, you have the ability to do a screen share, you've got about 2 minutes or so, but there's additional time if the client, has follow-up questions or maybe says, hey, we want you to dive into a certain topic or something like that. The audience is going to be anyone who's not the primary speaker. So myself and the other contestants, and in some cases, industry participants, although today we don't have any industry participants. And then below that, again, we have some ideas in terms of the script. So we'll go through this. We're going to go through this with two of the students who are on or two of the forecast contestants that are on the call. And then we'll get into our regular forecast contest discussion today. I'm the weekly leader in terms of the agenda. Once we get past the communications, I think we'll go through sort of our normal process in terms of first focusing on attribution and then getting into the current forecast. There were a couple questions that were submitted by Philip Ye, who's not available today, and we'll try to hit those questions too during the course. All right, so let's get going here. Michael Garoon has volunteered to be our first our guinea pig here. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you. Again, we're over here, we're your clients, you're the vendor, and we can begin whenever you're ready.
Okay. So hello everyone. My 16 to 20 day forecast is for 90.7 HDDs with a 1 sigma spread of 19.3 HDDs. This HDD forecast is approximately the same as the 10-year normal, so I'm predicting normal conditions in the 16 to 20 day time frame. This forecast is also slightly warmer than the 30-year normal, which is coming in around 92.3 HDDs. So about what we've been seeing these past couple of weeks, with there being very close to the 10 and 30-year normals. My forecast was based on a blend 60% of teleconnections, so the AO, the NAO, and the PNA, a 30% insertion of the CPC forecast, and a 10% of the 10-year normal. This weighting scheme, I've seen good success with this weighting scheme in longer-term forecasts. And all of these things put together gave me the 90.7 forecast, and gave me a basic outlook of the pattern, which to me says that the pattern will be there will be a trough in the central part of the country, which both my teleconnections weighting and my CPC weighting both agreed on this, with a little bit of ridging on the east and west coasts, so you'll have a little bit of warmth on the east coast and west coast, and most of the cold will be in the central part of the country. As for some forecast risks, there are several. One being the main part of my forecast, the teleconnections. If they do not, if they do not all become negative as they are forecast to do, then the pattern could change in certain ways. For an example, if the PNA goes to positive instead of negative, you'll see more ridging on the west coast and more troughing on the east coast, leading to more HDDs for the forecast period. The MJO is also a risk. I didn't include it in my weighting scheme, but I did look at it. It's currently in the null phase, but if something is to happen in the next 3 weeks to push it into one of the other phases that could affect the pattern, then that it also needs to be watched. But right now, I don't think that will be. Sorry. And, I don't think that will be a very big risk. Um, and I believe that is all I've got for you today. Are there any questions that anyone has about anything or needs clarification on? I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Do you have any questions?
No.
Michael, I have one question, and let's just stay in character until we break. I've noticed that we've noticed that in the past couple weeks, the forecast has been coming in colder. Like I was before this call, I was looking at the 1 to 5 and 6 to 10, and I'll show you on my, since you guys can see my screen. I'll show you what I mean by that. You can see here the maps here. This is like the 1 to 5 up top, and down here is a lot of the 6 to 10 from the various models, and 11 to 15. And Michael, this is a lot colder than a lot of the forecasts we're expecting from a week or two ago. Is there any concern that we're going to see things continue to come in colder, including for the current 16 to 20-day forecast?
If I might for just a moment, if I understand your question, you're asking if do you want me to just do the 16 to 20 or the previous weeks as well? Like the currently verifying forecasts?
Well, I'm just asking if, so the 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, those periods, I think, they're coming in a lot colder than expected. Like, I'll give you an example more specifically. Like, if we look at, let's pull up our 16 to 20. I know this is not verified yet, but let's see. Is it this week? Sure, let's look at this week. So this is October 30th to November 3rd. So let's look at these numbers here, right? A lot of 60s, and so that's October 30th to November 3rd. Let's see how that's coming in here. October 30th, we'll use, thankfully, Maxar. I've got their tool, so I'm going to pull it up here. And it's going to tell me, so their number as of today, and of course, what's today? Today's the 28th or something like that. So this is just a couple days away. So it could bust, but it's unlikely to bust too much. I'm making that assumption. It's projected to come in now at 92. The 30-year 69.7. So let's just make sure we're looking at the right window. Yeah, 69.7. So we're looking at the same one. So what did I say? It's supposed to come in at, projected to come in at 92. So Michael, I guess, my point is this period is coming in a lot colder now than we were expecting 2 weeks ago. I'm concerned as a client that maybe you guys, since you guys missed this forecast, you guys were too warm, that you're going to be too warm in the current 16 to 20. Should I be concerned about that? How are you addressing that? Is it a risk?
Well, when it comes to forecasts at this range, it's always a risk. We can't eliminate all risks, but based on the pattern configuration, the expected pattern configuration, I should say, the risks. I think that our forecast is correct. Excuse me. And I think that while yes, there was a bust for this forecast period, the we had some difficulty seeing the extent of the cold. We did see cold, we just didn't expect it to be to this extent. Obviously, you've seen the data, it's well beyond the 30 and 10-year normals, so it's a very abnormal period. We expect it to return closer to normalcy, and if you even look, excuse me, at those 1 to 5, 5 to 10, and 11 to 15, you can see there's even a little bit of progression into the 11 to 15-day period where uh, even the ensembles indicate that there's some warmth building. And generally speaking, when there's warmth building in the west, it does begin to move towards the east in terms as the pattern does appear to be favorable to some form of progression. Um, since none of the uh, teleconnections such as the NAO, AO, or PNA indicated that there would be a strong blocking pattern anywhere. More of a weak blocking pattern, maybe holding things up for a day or two. Um, so, overall, to answer your question, to sum it all up, for this forecast period, I don't think that there's a very big chance of it being a bust. I think we'll probably see something along the lines of what I said. Of course, that's not to say that there are no risks. I wouldn't want to. That would be misleading to tell you that there are no risks. Um, but I'm confident in the forecast I put out.
Okay. Okay, I think we call that a wrap. Why don't we move on to Zach's now? And again, we'll just switch roles now. So now, Michael, you can grill Zach. And I should have warned too, right? Like the idea here is we're supposed to not try to be jerks, but to ask tough questions, right? Mm-hmm. That's what we're here for. So you guys are the vendors, I'm the client or whatever, and that's what normally happens. So hopefully I wasn't too hard on you. And then we can after we go through both you guys, we can if we want, we could do a recap, and then we'll do a little bit of recap offline too in terms of how we can make it better for next time. All right, with that, let's turn it over to Zach.
Yeah. All right, hey guys, my 16 to 20-day forecast is for 93 HDDs and a 1 sigma spread of 21.4 HDDs. This forecast is slightly colder than the 30-year normal forecast at 92.3 HDDs, and my spread is also slightly larger than the 30-year as well. My forecast process is a blend of the 30-year, the EC, and the CPC. My main takeaway for you guys is that there's what I believe to be an anomalously strong ridge in the western half of the U.S. That's based on what I saw in the EC model, and then the CPC is also showing a bit of a strong anomalous trough in the Midwest, so that has the potential to make population centers like Detroit, Chicago, and St. Louis a bit cooler than normal. In terms of risks, I didn't really see much in the teleconnections like the MGO, the PNA, the NAO. Some of them were showing like maybe a weak negative pattern, but I interpreted that as mostly neutral, and the MGO is projected to be in the null. But again, we're 16 to 20 days out, so there's the potential that these could change. And another risk that I wanted to point out is the fact that we've seen that over the last couple of weeks, the models have not necessarily adjusted to the cold shift that we've seen over the last month or so. And I believe, as in our last forecast, we were much too cold, about 30 HDDs, too warm, that we're being misguided a bit. So I'm not really entirely sure if the models have necessarily adjusted yet. And if I'm basing most of my forecast process off the models, there's potential that my forecast may have some problems. But I am still fairly confident that this pattern is going to appear. So does anyone have any questions?
Michael, any questions on your end?
None that I can think of.
Okay. If something comes up, we can always interrupt. I'm just looking at your forecast. Oh wait, I have to update it, right? Let me update it.
That was it.
Oh, it was there? Oh, sorry. Let me go back. I just missed it. Oh, there it is. So, can you tell me? So I'm new here. Can you tell me how you came up with that formula? Why you specifically use that formula as opposed to say 100% EC? Isn't the EC a pretty good model?
Let's start. So from my experience, the 30-year normal is the forecast metric to beat in the heating season. So I definitely keep a pretty heavy weight on that metric. The EC has had some trouble in the past. It's not perfect. No model is perfect. And especially in this, I'd still consider this a transition period. And within our contest, we've shown that the EC has trouble forecasting in this EC period. So I'm not putting 100% weight on it, but it's still important to keep in mind. And then the CPC I have used for the last 6 months or so. So I've done pretty well in the forecast contest. So I trust the CPC's output. So when I came up with my forecast this week, I basically just put an equal weight on all 3 things and just kept them all in mind rather than one over the other.
Okay. 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 I think I'm good. Michael, you're good?
I have a question. I don't know if you looked at either of them, but the 0Z Euro Ensemble seems to show less of a trough in the eastern part of the country than the 0Z GFS Ensemble. Is that something that you think is a possibility? Could we see a bigger trough in the eastern part of the country, which would result in I imagine, some colder temperatures and some colder HDD values?
I'd say there's always the potential for that, but if we're being completely honest, the EC is generally more of a trustworthy model than the GFS, just because it's just a better model in general. So if I were to factor one in more than the other, I definitely lean towards the EC pattern more than the GFS pattern. But that's always a possibility. It's tough to figure out how these patterns will progress, and there's the potential that trough that I mentioned that over the Midwest could shift over to the eastern half of the U.S. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. But I would trust the EC more than the GFS.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So we'll take a break from in character. Again, I'm thinking, just so that we don't take the rest of the time on this, maybe let's just have like a 2-minute recap in terms of our thoughts, and then we can have you and I and then others, we can have more of a recap offline where we can talk about how to improve it for next time. But maybe just initial thoughts, especially from you guys, just going through that. Does it help? Did it not help? Any observations in terms of going through that process?
I mean, you can go, Mike.
No, you can go.
I liked it. It forced me to be more concise about my process, and communicating is very, very important. And it's definitely a little bit more nerve-wracking than our normal reel, just because you want to get it right. You want to be concise. You want to get your message across as good as possible. So I think doing it a couple more times will definitely get you in that groove and make it less nerve-wracking, I guess, because I feel like in the middle I got a little bit rusty and unclear, but I think it's a good thing.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I was gonna basically say the same thing. I think it's good experience, since like you said, something you have to do on the job. At least if you're a a forecast producer for industry in the 16 to 20 day period. Sorry. The only thing I'll add is that I think there should be some type of I don't maybe like have it your summary written kind of like a or speech or whatever you want to call it written up somewhere, and then people can people that listened in, they can have like a section where you can leave feedback, because in my experience, feedback is always good to have, whether it's good or bad. So like Zach said, if he thought he did well with the first part and got a little choppy on the second part or the middle part, somebody can leave feedback to help him improve the second part if he needs it. Um, something like that. I don't know if that's something that's doable,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, that's something we could think about too. I like that. Yeah, no, on my end, I liked it too. I mean, it was helpful for me just hearing. It was a lot easier to assimilate what your forecast was doing it this way than the way we normally do it. It's nice to hear it, like even just the way you laid it out, like you guys, here's my number, here's how it compares to the 30-year as a reference point, here's how it's changed or whatever, maybe in the last couple of weeks, and then here's my basic formula, and here's some of the risk. I felt like we were able to encapsulate things a lot better. I think, just some initial thoughts in terms of things to work on. I think, just continuing to work on the brevity. I think we could even get it more concise, absolutely, in terms of nailing down the bottom line. Maybe we were more like 2 to 4 minutes, but we'd probably be closer. I think we could do it in 2 minutes. Like, I really think we could say 2 minutes. I think in some cases you might even be able to do 1 minute, and it's always up to the client, really.
Yeah.
I think we could also, I think we're intentionally not trying to be too abrasive, but I think as we go through this more, we should intentionally interrupt, because that's just the reality. In other words, Michael may say something like today, today we're forecasting 100 HEDs, which is significantly colder than normal and a lot colder than last week. Whoa, Michael, the client might say, Michael, what happened? What changed? He's not going to let you finish, right? So maybe next time we can interject with that, because that's just reality, right? And try to throw you off a little bit, but also prepare you for how those things really go.
Okay.
Yeah. If I might interject another idea, you mentioned like having different times. Maybe instead of telling people that every week you've got 2 minutes, maybe throw them a curveball occasionally. Say today you've only got a minute and a half, or maybe today you've got 4 minutes, so you have to talk a little longer. Because I'm assuming that you don't always have 2 minutes to talk to a client. Maybe it's like 3:59. It's like, hey, I need to know like right now if I can buy this gas stock or whatever. I don't think that's how it works, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if some people have done that.
No, that's a really great idea. That is. So we can make it whoever is the leader for that week, or if it's me in the foreseeable future. Right. I think that's a great idea. Make it random. So I might throw you off and say, hey, Zach, I just got a minute today. Give it to me in a minute. And it'll throw you off the first time, and it'll throw you off maybe every time. But it's good to learn how to do that, because Michael's right. That's going to happen. That's just life, right? You're going to get on a call with some big company, and they're going to be like, dude, I don't have time today. So that's a great idea. One other thing I was thinking is we can use the rest of the other forecasts, other forecast streams on our forecast inputs on the board, as you could think of that as, competition's the right word, but the market. The market's probably the right word. So in other words, I might ask you. Let me see if I find a good example. Let me sort this.
Paul Rundy is probably a good example.
Sorry?
Paul Rundy's probably a good example. He's got the lowest forecast.
Yeah, okay, 75. So, right, and then Zach, yeah, this is good. So I might say to Zach next time, like, Zach, hey, you're at 93, Paul's at 75. Why do you think you're so much different, right? And some of these, again, some of these things you may not have a good answer for or may catch you off guard, but that's okay. That's the real process, right? So that's sort of the intent. Sometimes you're going to be thrown off, and how do you respond to that, right? But putting you in that position so you can look at the board, try to look at the board in advance and try to prepare for those things. Look at the board as the market, because you do get those kinds of questions a lot. For example, you'll get a question like, why are you so much, hey, Max or whoever it is, why are you so much colder than the ECMWF? Or why are you so much colder than CFS? Or, hey, there's this other group out there that's at 50 HDDs and you're at 100. Why do you think you're so much colder? You're going to get those questions. Not always easy to answer. Sometimes you don't have a lot of information to work with, so you have to speculate. Sometimes the best thing to say is, I really don't know why they're at 50. I can tell you why I'm at 100, but the point to remember is they're the client, and you're going to try to help them out as best as you can. And of course, you have to try to also remember to be polite and not lose your cool when you feel like they're asking you a tough question and you want to say, like, dude, leave me alone. You have to be careful about that, right? Because you don't want to offend them. Yeah, it's easy when you get in that situation to get abrasive and stuff. So, all right, no, I like that. So we'll any other sort of short-term ideas before we shift to something else here?
The only thing that I am thinking of currently right now is that we should probably, eventually, we should move to whoever's doing their their forecast pitch should be sharing their screen when they do it, and going through and showing their steps, kind of like a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if you could really do that over the phone, but we'll pretend that there's some people in the room as well as on the phone. But I think for the next couple of weeks, we should just leave it with the forecast discussion leader, just to let people kind of get their feet wet and get used to the process a little bit. Because I'll be honest with you, I was looking at the email you sent with the script, essentially the entire time, just to kind of make sure I wasn't missing anything and was staying, on topic, I guess is the word.
Yeah.
Because I'm not used to doing it, so
it's normal.
Yeah. So I think for the next few weeks we should keep it as the forecast discussion leader holds onto the screen, at least until people get used to doing it this way.
Yeah, and I think some of that, that's probably for a bigger discussion, but some of that can be optional too. A lot of times you're on phone calls and you don't have a screen share. Sometimes you do. So, I think to some degree, I think it should be up to the vendor if you want to act like this call is going to include a screen share. Great. If you want to try to do it like you're just talking on the phone, I think that's okay too, because both things will happen.
Yeah, and we could actually, that gives me an idea, we could actually add that as an extra, randomness to having to do it, similar to the time where, when the person comes up, the discussion leader or maybe somebody else can say, it's phone only today, you don't have to screen share, or, you get unlucky, you draw the short straw, it's like, well, now you have to screen share because you've got 2 clients that are with you today.
Yeah, the one thing with the screen share, this is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but usually you do a screen share when you have more time, right? It's like a presentation. So usually it's not a 2-minute thing. So if we're trying to make it a 2-minute thing, which I think we are at first, probably screen share you don't want, right? It's just, you know what I mean?
No, that makes sense.
Presentation. But that being said, I like the idea of seeing that evolution, and we could try those kinds of things. Or it could be, again, that the client, it could be all of the above, where the client says, hey, Michael, I got 10 minutes today. Can you share your screen? Because I would like to look at a couple things with you. I think we could try to do stuff like that. It could either be random or it could be, scheduled like that. So that's good. Okay. All right. We can, we'll switch gears. We'll do an abbreviated, normal forecast discussion here. All right. So switching gears. So I think, I think this is, I feel like we say this every week, but I think this is another interesting week in the forecast world, in the market. Some of the stuff we were just kind of talking about through our communications thing. But so, we're going to start with the attribution. And I feel like, there's two parts to the attribution. One is the verification we have, and then the information that's not quite yet verified, but it's in the short term. It's getting close, and there's some interesting things there. So, but just taking a look, and again, everyone can interject here just because I'm the team lead here, or whatever. You guys just jump in. But, we have, first of all, but did anyone find any problems with the functionality changes there? Okay.
I didn't do anything.
All right, nothing there. All right, good. All right, so we'll move past that. So we've got 2 weeks of verification so far in the seeding season, or at least up to 2 weeks, depending on how many times you forecast. It's been a tough 2 weeks so far. I mean, obviously that first week was a doozy. And it looks like Zach continuing the hot streak where he left off last time. It looks like the leader here with 2 forecasts, at least the human leader, slightly below the 30-year. And then we've got a lot of scores below that, which are tough. But on a weekly basis, and I'll switch to, what was it, 10-8? I think it's the last week. Okay. Yeah, we definitely did better. The average forecast score was better this week than it was last week. Last week was a really brutal one. Interestingly, the MJO analog, I think, is actually the best input. I could go back to look at that. If you look in the sandbox, it's done pretty well here, the MJO analog. It could be a coincidence, but anyway, it's been pretty good. And of course, the verification has been near the 30-year the last couple of weeks. So it's coming cooler than we expected, or a lot of us expected anyway. So I think that's part of the reason why, there was a lot of expectations still that things were going to be warmer, especially last week. It's coming in closer to the 30-year. The 30-year numbers have been tough to beat, but also the MJO analog tends to be pretty close to the 30-year, and that's also maybe in part why it's right. So I think way too early to say whether it's really skillful or not, or if it's sort of like a broken clock type thing, but interesting nonetheless. Trying to think if there's something else. Again, I wanted to bring this up. I think Zach brought this up in the communications, but I think really important to bring it up again. I wish I had the chart that Luke is kind of working on and developed in the summer, where we're able to visualize this. But again, the ECMWF really missed this pattern change. And you can see it in the numbers. I'm going to go back to the heating season summary, and I'm going to sort by the bias. And look at the bias in the EC. It's got the worst bias, -13. So in HDD's world, that means that it was too warm. So it was almost 14 HDDs below what verified. So not nearly cold enough. So the EC got off to a bad start, in particular last week, but this week also. I think it was the second lowest score. So not a good start to the HDD season with the ECMWF. Again, really missing the pattern change. If you had gone with the EC a few weeks ago, if you gone in full in, like sort of the question I asked Zach, like if you had put 100% weight on the EC, you would have got crushed, and the market moved a lot during that. So just, again, something to keep in mind. I don't really know exactly the why. That's maybe a longer discussion, but an observation nonetheless.
I could be wrong, but was this the week? This forecast, was this the week that we were talking about the EC's 500 millibar pattern, where it seems to lose all the troughs?
If it wasn't the week, it was. I mean, it's still, I think, relevant because it's almost every week, right? That we
Yeah.
there, right? It's there almost every week where we see that.
At this point, I'd have to assume, based on at least the last two forecasts that verified and the most recent one that we just did, I'd have to say that I think there's, at least in the ensembles. I didn't look at the actual EC proper, but at least in the ensembles, I think washing away the trothiness because of I think they've shown it. It's shown it plenty of times where it's like, a third of them are doing this, third of them are doing something else, another third of them are doing something else. I think it just tends to wash away the troughs, and because of that, you end up losing something more a more clear and concise pattern where you can say, okay, you can look at the model and say, well, it's only given me 45 HDDs, but with that trough, that doesn't seem right. Something like that, I would imagine. And even there, it's like there's, if I'm looking at this right, there's a pretty big ridge over the west coast that should have a response downstream of trough in the east, especially if it's that broad. But you know, so just missing it, at least assuming this pattern, is correct, that should it's missing the trough again. There's no blue anywhere over the U.S., even though there's a lot of orange. And
I think that's a good point. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's a fair point to say about the ECMWF overall. But I think it's also, just to defend the EC in this case, there is some blue on the map, right? And it doesn't look all that different than the blue is less across Greenland and stuff. Certainly, I'm toggling between the CFS. But in fairness, across the U.S., the CFS does show a broader ridge pattern developing. It could be right? I mean, it is possible that we go to a more zonal flow and that there is an expansive ridge over the entire continental United States. So I just want to make that distinction, that pattern, in my experience, this pattern is not impossible to have if you're getting a more zonal flow. That being said, I understand your point of saying maybe that this will end up being more amplified and there will be more troughing in the east.
yeah, I mean, no, I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying that at least on the Euro, and it looks like that ridge is more amplified in the west, because on the CFS it doesn't. It looks kind of like flat. It's all relatively the same color, but the EC has a pretty broad area of one of the darker. I guess that's orange or yellow or whatever you want to call it. Just looks to me like the EC has a stronger ridge, which should elicit a stronger trough response.
Yeah. So I'm just feel free to interrupt, but I'm just going to move quick just because of time. I then wanted to bring up the question, or just a little bit of analysis on kind of related to the question I asked Michael about the fact that this hasn't verified yet, but the 1 to 5 and 6 to 10 is coming in a lot colder. I'm afraid to see what my scores are going to be the next couple of weeks. Anyway, this is that October 3rd, November 3rd. This is, it's coming in 92 HDDs. And it's not just that one period. This, however you want to look at it, we were looking at the maps earlier, the 1 to 5, 6, 10, 11, 15 maps. They're all cold. Here, Radiant puts it in number form for you. So you can look at the daily HDDs, and you could also look at them composite 1 to 5, 6, 10, 11 to 15. And the bottom line, these numbers are big. So barring a big change in the shorter range, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see those HD numbers verify at the top or above what a lot of our numbers are. And, again, it's the question, that question almost inevitably begs the question of whatever's happening here. Well, one, why? Why did the models miss us? And two, does it matter for the 16 to 20? And I think for the first part of it, the short answer to me is I don't know exactly. I've looked at a couple different things, not comprehensively, but that Radiant put out and that also Rispulse. And it sounds like to some degree this was a surprise to some of these groups too. And pardon if that's not the case. I'm not reading every report every day. It's not obvious to me that it's like, sort of an MGO type thing or something like that. The MGO, here's the latest. We've got the MGO here that's now sort of at the edge of phase 3. But when you look at some of the composites and stuff like that, I felt like there was a kind of a muddle, like the lag composites. I felt like it was a little bit of a muddled signal. Professor Roundy's tool, I think, was of the data points I saw, I thought that was one of the data points that showed this period being, leaning on the cold side. So maybe there's something there worth digging into. But I think I guess let me just stop there, because the main point I'm bringing up is I think it's, in my opinion, it's a very open question in terms of why the models did not better resolve this cold and what it was exactly that they missed that now they're seeing that's reflecting in all the cold 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15 day composites. Let me turn it over to you guys. Anything you want to add to that?
Just something. It's not very related, but it goes to the overall scores we've been seeing that have been a little less than accurate. At least according to the CRPS. I think part of the reason for that, and then not to say that we've been doing well, but I think part of the reason is, since I believe you said once that if the verification is near the 30-year, then it really hurts your score if you're even slightly off. Because I noticed that my forecast was only off by, I think, 2 HDDs, but I had a slightly larger spread, and because of those things, I actually had a negative, I think the score was like negative 1.9, if I remember correctly. And, being 2 HDDs off, you would think it's like, oh, well, that's got to be a good forecast, but it was not in terms of the CRPS. So just some food for thought as to the why the scores haven't been too great recently. But to answer more towards your question, I'd say that part of the problem, at least I think for the EC, is it has trouble seeing like really cold events, which I would characterize this as a really cold event, considering the 30-year normal for the period is, I think, about 70 HDDs, and we're verifying 20 above that, which is no small feat, especially for early November, I would think. So I think now it actually can see the cold air. It's the data is in there so that it knows, like, wow, this air is really cold. Maybe I should begin to adjust future forecasts from this. So I think it's a problem with the initialization, where it just either doesn't see the cold, or it didn't see the cold when this forecast was made, or it just didn't know what to do with it. Like, it wasn't programmed to, I don't know, handle that level of extreme below normal temperatures, if that makes sense.
Yep.
I'll add something. So could you go to last week's forecast?
1 week before this?
Yeah. I was looking at this earlier. So no, not this one. So I think if you look, both the EC, like this is for the forecast we made last week, both the EC and the CFS were coming in cooler than the 30-year.
Yeah.
But then if you looked at this week, the EC went warmer, but then the CFS went much, much colder. I think the CFS is the coldest forecast. So it's almost like the it almost seems like the CFS is catching the cold. It's just like a week or two late, whereas the EC is just kind of hovering around the 30-year and not really getting it. But I just thought that was interesting because I saw the 102. I was like, oh, who put the 102? But it was the CFS. So it seems, based on what we're seeing these last, the 1 to 5, 6 to 10 stuff, the CFS is getting the cold. It's just too late. I think from what we've seen this week is like this, the 16 to 20 is not going to be the same as those three different, like the 1 to 5, 6 to 10, or at least has the potential to be different. So it's interesting that the CFS does not agree with that.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I found one other, speaking of that, this is, it's interesting, it's just 'cause it's a little bit of a different interpretation. I found it interesting that same week, was the last week, the CFS was actually warm, like for most of the summer. I remember, we saw and it verified that the CFS was just too cold, right? Like a broken, like every week, cold, much colder than what generally verified, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the bias. And then finally, when it's actually one of the warmer data points here, I think this week, and it might have been the week before that too, the forecast actually gets cold.
Yeah.
Like it's actually cold. So the one time or whatever where the CFS goes warm, it actually does verify cold. It's like, my God, all summer long it was cold. Now it actually gets cold and it was warm.
Yeah.
How frustrating. So like, I didn't know what to make of that.
And then like, I think that kind of just like backs up the point I just made, where it's like now it looks like this period is going to go back to a little bit warmer again, and then the CFS is going too cold.
Right, you're right.
It's like it's always the opposite.
And how do you trust it too, right? So it's like, finally it's going back cold, and maybe it will be cold again, or maybe it's just back to being cold like it is 90% of the time.
Yeah. Honestly, this is going to sound kind of ridiculous, but I think, and this might just be some confirmation bias, but maybe the CFS has a reverse correlation to the forecast. So like if it says cold, it's going to be warm, you put warm. If it says warm, you put cold because it's going to be cold. And that might be a bit far-fetched and someone would need to look into it. But if that's the case, then that's a pretty significant thing, because if the CFS says cold, it's like, okay, I know it's going to be warm. But if it says warm, it's like, okay, I see the cold coming, and then that puts you like a step ahead of, I would imagine, a step ahead of everybody else if you know that it's going to be particularly cold in that particular window.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because Luke LaBelle's working on some of the stuff, looking at trying to automate some of the weighting schemes and stuff like that. And one of his analyses from the summer, where he's looking at the best weighting, the optimal weighting between the EC, CFS, and I think he threw in like 30-year normal as a data point, so any combination. And I think the best that the model spit out, or I shouldn't say model, but was it a regression or something? Maybe it was included a small negative correlation of the CFS. Now, that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that that necessarily is something that's significant or that is going to provide value out of sample. But for what it's worth, in the summer, there was the optimal weighting, according to that schema, was to include a slight negative correlation on the CFS. And then most of the other weighting actually included the 10-year normal. The 10-year normal, very little on the EC, and then a little bit of a negative correlation or weighting on the CFS. So I'm looking at the clock. I'm thinking today we could, just for the sake of time, we can skip the forecast just so that we don't go over. I think we've kind of alluded to the forecast here quite a bit, and folks can obviously look at the forecast for more information. But
you haven't shared your forecast.
What's that?
You haven't talked about what your forecast is.
Yeah, I mean,
talk about that quickly if you want.
Sure. I would just say with my forecast, I guess two things that might be of interest. So one, in terms of my weighting scheme, it is slightly different. One, it continues to evolve as the boring sort of message I've mentioned most weeks, where I'm putting more weight on the 30-year normal, less weight on the 10-year normal, based on some of the performance metrics, and also just my view, interpretation of climate change and how it's having stronger influence in the United States in the summer than winter. So I did that. You'll notice this weighting scheme shifted 5-10%. One other thing I did, for better or worse, is I put 5% weighting on the CFS. I've not weighted the CFS any for quite a few months now. The reason I did that is not because past performance the last couple of weeks has been so much better, but just my view that in the winter, this is more subjective, experiential, that the CFS should be included at least to a small degree. I feel uncomfortable saying 0%. So 5% on the CFS. I didn't change my EC. I think it's 30%. One other thing I want to bring up, this is some of the research that Zach and I are working on, but I felt like it was related to this forecast or whatever. This is looking at EPO change as a function of MJO phase and amplitude. We're looking at days 16 to 20, so lag 16 to 20, and we're looking, and it considers dates near this time of year, so October 29th. And EPO that's the pattern near Alaska. So negative is when it's negative, there's a ridge, or typically there's a ridge over Alaska, like there is kind of right now. And when there's big trough over Alaska, the readings are positive. It's opposite of the NAO. NAO, when it's did I say that right? Or it's
I think it's the same.
Is it the same?
Because negative NAO is ridge over Greenland, and I think negative EPO, is ridge Alaska.
I think I said that wrong. I think the EPO is the opposite. So I'll have to double check that. Now I'm just confusing myself a little bit, but so anyway, the idea was to see, my thought was to see, is there a relationship here with the EPO that we might be able to apply qualitatively or subjectively, to the forecast. It's not looking directly at HDDs or CDDs, but again, looking at the Alaska pattern. And this was another reason why I did not modulate my forecast as a function of the MJO was, remember where the MJO is right now. This is based on the initialized. It's basically right in the neutral zone here, right in that nothing zone, if you will, or at least where the anomalies and the change tends to be weak. So there just wasn't much of a signal here. Now, obviously, if it was further out here in phase 1 or phase 8, or if it was much deeper, a higher amplitude into phases 3 and 4, that's a different story. But where it is right now, I did not see a strong signal. I will say one of the things I'm really interested in seeing, and hopefully we'll have this soon at some point, Zach's working on, and I think it's really applicable to the currents. I would love to look at it with respect to some of the things we just talked about. Hey, why is the 1 to 5, 6, 10, 11, why are these periods coming in so much colder? I'd love to look at the relationship between MJO model error during this period to see if there was something we could glean from that. Now, we don't have that data right now. It's something you're working on, and we're working on getting that data. Mm-hmm. But it would be interesting to see, going back when those 16 to 20-day forecasts were initialized. So now, you go back to, earlier in October, obviously, and stuff like that. But back when the, MJO was out here in phase 1 and 2, it'd be really interesting to look at the model error MJO model error relationships. Maybe it would show us nothing. Maybe it would be in the neutral zone. Maybe. But wouldn't it be provocative if it showed one of two things? A, that based on MJO, that we historically were in a period of higher errors, regardless of which direction, but just, hey, if your normal 1 standard deviation error is 15, maybe in that situation it would tell us you should expect 20. Yeah. That would have been an important data point. And 2, this would be even better if it had told us which direction, i.e. bias. If it had told us that, hey, the models tend to underestimate the HDs or the cold or the warmth, whatever. In this case, hopefully it would have been nice if it said they underestimate the cold, and then we may have had a heads up to say, hey, model error, EC error may be high in this situation, and it may underestimate the cold. Obviously, I'm speculating. I have no idea what it will show, but it'll be great once we're there because, again, it could potentially provide some insight into that situation and hopefully future situations.
I'll just toss in
Yeah, go ahead.
last thing is that using Dr. Decker's MJO analog, it was the best score of the past 2 verified forecasts. So I'm assuming that since neither of the CFS or the Euro were close in terms of score, which indicate their forecasts as well, that the models must have missed something in the MJO that looking at a pure MJO analog did not, or something else that they or the model saw something else that overrode the MJO. So I know I read in the CPC discussion that there's I think they said record-breaking Indian dipole event going on. So that might have something to do with it, since models tend to struggle when there's something record-breaking going on in the atmosphere, like last year's polar vortex disruption. So I mean, that's speculation, but it's a possibility, I'd say.
Yeah, and that some of those things are good. Maybe talking points too for next time. I think there's a lot there in terms of, and maybe I think we'll have Matt Lanza I think next week. Maybe we could ask him that question. How, in his experience, how do the models resolve significant climatic events, i.e., El Nino, Indian Ocean dipole? Do they resolve it better or worse? I think there could be some different opinions on that. So I think that's a good topic. I will say, back to your MJO analog, should have mentioned this. For what it's worth, this week it is showing, for this week's forecast, slightly below the 30-year. So it is a little bit warmer than the 30-year here. So, there's one more data point that suggests maybe that this colder pattern, although to some degree unexpected, may not be long-lived. We'll see. Any other parting thoughts before we close it out?
Nothing from me.
No.
What's that?
You have me nervous for next week.
Oh, I know. No. Well, I only realized that because Matt Rogers, who was a part of our forecast contest, I think was
last week.
2 weeks. Yeah, last week, mentioned the fact that it's coming in so much stronger. So anyway, so we'll talk more about that next week. All right. Well, thanks everyone here, and I think that's it. So we'll talk to you again next week. All right. Thanks, Michael.
Yep. Have a good day.
All right. Bye, guys.